All right, well, let's get started. I think we have a quorum.
And they had.
And some others will be able to join us as we go. So you want to start the recording?
Already gone.
Oh, it's already gone. Okay, great. All right, well, thanks, everybody. Good to see you again. It's been a while. Yes, I think I've been seeing many of you since the Great Salt Lake Issues Forum, and then we had our last meeting as a committee back in March. So great to we've got a lot on our agenda, lots of updates. There's a lot going on. And just to go run through the agenda really quick here. Christine and Mike will give us an update on conditions at the lake, and Christine will give us an update on salinity, as well as the mineral extraction study that started. Ben's going to give a quick update on the comprehensive management plan, and Jim Harris, Leanna on, I don't see Jim yet, but is going to give us an update on Division of Water Quality's rulemaking. Then Mike, I presume, will give us an update on the lakeside flow gauge, or at the West Breach, I should say. And then Jake Sarago was going to talk to us a little bit about the salt balance conceptual model, and Elliot that they've been working on. And then if we have time, I would love to revisit our research plan, and how and get some ideas on how we can move that forward, where we might still have some gaps. So anything else anybody wants to come? Oh, hey, Jim. Great. Well, let's do introductions quick here. Marissa.
Hi. Marissa Weber, Forestry Fire and State Land.
Jeff Dembliker, Jacobs.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
Mike Freeman, U.S. Geological Survey.
Laura Vernon, Water Resources.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Elliot Jignicki, Utah Geological Survey.
Andrew Ruppke, Utah Geological Survey.
David Steyerman, Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands.
John Left, Wildlife Resources.
Jennifer Biggs, Forestry Fire and State Lands.
Joe Harris, Division of Water Quality.
Phil Grove, Great Salt Lake Rancher Cooperative.
Great. And then online, I see Leanna Littler-Wolf, DWQ, Layla Amadi with Water Resources, Mark Reynolds with US Magnesium, and I think I saw Rob Dubuque as well, Friends, Great Salt Lake. So anybody else online that and there's Joe Havasie. I'm glad you can make it. And Ben Holcomb just joined. Anybody else online that I didn't mention? All right. I guess the first thing on the agenda here is just I sent out a summary of our meeting from March for your review. Any comments or changes that anybody would like to make? Do that. I didn't hear from anybody. If there were any changes. And if not, I'll entertain a motion to approve those.
So moved.
Second.
I'll second.
All right. All those in favor of approving the summary, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any other discussion? All right. Those are approved unanimously. Thank you. Let's see. So the next item on our agenda is just our update on lake conditions. You want to drive?
Okay, well, I'll just introduce Mike. I don't know how many of you have met Mike Freeman. He's our Salt Lake City field office chief. He's a wizard at hydroacoustics, all things hydrology on Great Salt Lake. He's worked out there for a really long time. He's a great resource. And he's going to go through the kind of lake elevation discharge record that Ryan usually goes through. So.
So Ryan kind of gave me, he just kind of talks to you guys about what the gauges are doing, kind of what we've seen. So we'll start with the south arm. Basically, 2 days ago, we were at 4194.7. We're starting to come down a little bit. We hit the peak. Probably like around middle of May or so. So our seasonal low, if we look at it for water year, was right on the first. So 4192. That's actually an approved value. Everything in pink, kind of on that bottom bar, is still provisional. Seasonal high right now we're at 4195.1. And then the lake came up about 3.1 feet. So, and they have about 1 million acre feet at the lake this year. So we just surveyed the Great Salt Lake. We have kind of or the south arm. We have a pretty extensive leveling process to make sure that data is correct. That was done on June 11th, and I'm working through that data right now. So this data should be approved hopefully within the next 2 weeks. So north arm saw daily value 2 days ago was 4192. Seasonal low was in September around 4188, and then our seasonal high was around June 17th. So you can see that it's still kind of coming up a little bit. We'll show some flows from the new breach, and we still have quite a bit of flow going from south to north. But the north row is about 3.5 feet. And this is a pretty interesting plot. If you kind of look at the kind of last year into this year, you can see the rise in 2023. And the north arm kind of stayed, didn't really respond too much. And then you can see this year, everything's kind of started to come back up, and it's showing a pretty similar trace to the south arm. But the difference right now is about 2.6 feet. Both of these gauges were visited in the last 2 weeks, so the data is accurate. We don't have any issues with any of the gauges right now, so which is always a good thing. So if we look at surface water inflow, this is just kind of looking at the main kind of inflows into the Great Salt Lake. So if we start with Bear River, you can kind of look at the top. We have about 67, 68 years of record. We're right around 1 million acre feet that's came into the lake thus far. So this is a cumulative inflow plot. So what this does is it takes daily values and it adds them up, and then it looks at the period of record. The gray line kind of in the middle of the green, that's the median. The green covers the 75th to the 25th percentile. So you can see we're sitting right about median. And then the blue is the highest observed, which is an 84. And the min is the yellow line, which is the 92. So if we kind of just keep moving through, we have Plain City. So we were Plain City. You can see that a little bit higher than the median, still kind of following that 25 to 75% zone. You can see that there's a big uptick. Anybody have any idea what that might have been from? It was basically all the reservoirs upstream, Rockport, Echo, were full, and so they were trying to make room for this year. So it's a big increase in flows on the Weaver. And Weaver ran pretty high again all year this year. So if we look at the Goggin, we kind of have the same thing. You can see this this big increase, and that's due to Utah Lake being a compromise. So we've seen a lot of flow coming down the Goggin drain to Missouri Canal. So and we have about 0.3 million acre feet. Sorry, if I go back to the Weaver, 0.36. So quite a bit of water coming in from those two systems. The last one is Farmington Bay. We have we're sitting at about 0.3 million acre feet for this one as well. Something of note for this one is it doesn't account for negative flow events, which we get sometimes at our gauges because of wind sessions. So this is just kind of an accumulative one. It doesn't take into account those negative flow events. Those negative flow events didn't really start happening until probably April, when the lake elevation reached 4194, and we started to kind of, the lake elevation came pretty similar to what Great Salt Lake and Farmington Bay was. So we start to get these wind sessions. So, yeah. Lastly, or I guess a few more slides here. This is the inflow or the flow from the south arm to the north arm at the Great Salt Lake breach, the new breach. And see if we had the lake elevation plot up, it followed the lake elevation pretty closely. So flows ramped up in February when lake elevation really started to shoot up. And we've been sitting pretty steady at right around that 2200 CFS. So you can see on the very bottom, we measured in May, measured 2200, and then in June, just a couple days ago, we measured 2160. So it's sitting pretty steady. The Great Salt Lake at Lakeside, we like to call this Lakeside Gauge. This has been dry for a year or so. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we got some instrumentation in. We're starting to estimate or compute discharge using index velocity methods. That went in April 4th. We have this flagged as estimated right now because of a lot of sedimentation in the Gage pool, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but we have pretty good flow going there as well. So it's nice to see some return flow to the lakeside. That's really me.
Does anyone have questions for me? All right, we'll talk about salinity real quick. So our most recent measurements for salinity come from GSLAC. So they collected samples on June 5th. USGS collected samples a week after that as part of our biannual water quality monitoring agreement with DEQ. That was like June 11th through the 13th. And then it happened that UGS was also up there on the 12th, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of see to the far right. You can see on the far right, those are our most recent measurements that we have. We're sitting below 120 grams per liter. And as of June 13th at 3510, our site in Gilbert Bay, we were at 111 grams per liter. At 2565, our site in Carrington, we were at 110 grams per liter. So we've seen a pretty good decrease since the fall. We also have recent shallow salinities at the new breach where we're getting 109 grams per liter, slightly more dilute than open water, but not a whole lot. Lakeside is at 111 grams per liter and Saltaire is 103. So looking pretty consistent across the lake. And there's not much of a difference between shallow and deep. Deep, we get about a 3 gram per liter difference, but not, it seems to be gradual. So it's not like any kind of layering. It's just a gradual kind of increase as we go from shallow to deep. And then if we zoom in on all 4 of our Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program sites, kind of see this is the record from October of 2022 to the present, so to June here. And just putting these recent numbers in a bit of context, last fall we were sitting at about 127 to 144 grams per liter. We've steadily been on the decline since then, and now we're in a range of, again, on June 12th. Well, that's kind of, our biannual measurements range from 103 to 111. And those are based on 7 open water sites where we collect water samples. So from the change from the fall to now is about 30 grams per liter where we've diluted that much. And these figures here in the lower right just kind of indicate that, if you remember, we started collecting, GSLAC had started collecting samples at 0.5 meter and 3 meters below surface. Those are pretty much the same at 3510 and 2565, our deeper sites in Carrington and Gilbert Bay. At 2267, that's our site fed by the Bear, north of Fremont Island. We do see the difference there where we're seeing fresher conditions at the surface. That was kind of temporary the week after that. So when USGS was out there, we didn't quite see as much of a difference. And then at 2767, at the northern end of Antelope, we see 109. So just to give you a sense of where we're at currently. And if it's okay, Jeff, I'll just dive into the salinity forecast. So Jeff asked me to look into my crystal ball and try to figure out what this fall and then the subsequent spring salinities are going to be. So
It might be the Christine ball.
maybe
Yeah, jumps through.
yeah. Okay, so we're all familiar with I think what I do here, considering what's coming in via precipitation, what's leaving the evaporation, what's coming in via inflows, and what's leaving through the breach. And our initial condition, I actually used UGS data for this since theirs was from June 12th, and they're really good about getting samples every, 5 feet. So we get samples throughout the water column, and it gives me a chance to do a volume weighted average a bit more easily. So when I did that, the volume weighted average for June was 111 grams per liter, kind of I think I'll remember how I do that. I attribute a concentration to kind of a volume and then layers throughout the lake. And then our volume in the south arm was around 7 million acre feet. So that's kind of our starting condition. And then I add and subtract all these different variables to try and predict what the fall conditions are. And just to remind you of what I'm modifying here. So south to north discharge. Right now, and this time I do account for lakeside. So I added the breach and lakeside together, and those two together is around 2,400 CFS that's leaving in June. And then I basically had to estimate what that export is going to be moving forward. And so it kind of ranges from a decrease of 100 to 300 CFS per month. And I did that iteratively by saying, okay, we exported this much in June. At the end of June, I predict the lake elevation to be this. And then using Andy's new rating curve, I can use that elevation to then say, what's the new discharge at the breach, and kind of iteratively, month by month, take down the estimated discharge at the new breach. For the climate, I did 3 different scenarios, and I'll explain those in a minute. And then the monthly breach salinities. This is something that Bill Johnson asked me to do, is to actually account for the mass of flux leaving through the breach. So I have to estimate a salinity each month when I estimate a discharge, if that makes sense. And I'm holding the inflow salinity constant at 4 grams per liter. So all the volume that I predict is going to be coming in is associated with a 4 gram per liter to get the mass there. The assumptions, kind of some of the big assumptions I'm making here, there's instantaneous mixing. That means fresh water comes in and it's instantaneously mixed across the south arm. We know that's not correct, but that's what this equation does. We assume, and then we assume that the south arm surface area is constant for during precipitation and evaporation, and basically assuming those cancel out. So here's the kind of the 3 different conditions that I estimate. I used the 2003 to 2022 climate record provided by Layla and Division of Water Resources that's their GSLAC input. So this first one is the average of precip, evaporation, and inflows using that data set, the 20 years of data set. For that one, I'm estimating that the south arm volume in the fall will be around 6.3 million acre feet, associated with a salinity of about 115. If I ramp up evaporation in the next kind of row down, same climate condition, but I'm just using a higher rate of evaporation. Salinities go up to 116 grams per liter. And then in this final one, I'm just using a 2012 to 2022 climate record with 90th percentile evaporation. That's around 118 grams per liter. So when I saw these numbers, I was initially like, dang it, I did it wrong. Because historically, we see, I think I go into this. Oops, so many animations. Historically, we see, oh, I didn't even include that, sorry. We see increases in salinity from spring to fall on the order of 20 to 30 to 40 grams per liter. So I was really puzzled by this. I'm still puzzled by this. I mean, we'll have to see how this plays out, but I did the calculation multiple times. I tried simplifying it. I tried doing different things, and it all was about the same. So what I'm thinking might be happening here is that our salt mass in the south arm is decreasing. So here's a plot of south arm salt mass from when I started kind of doing these forecasts. Every time I have to calculate a salt mass, right? So last June 2023, it was around 1,100 million tons. And since then, we've been steadily decreasing our salt mass in the south arm, as shown right here. So from spring to fall of last year, we decreased by about 60 million tons. And then from last fall to now, we've decreased it by about 80 million tons. So I'm thinking that we are just ratcheting down that salt mass, and that perhaps, the water that will be evaporating is just concentrating a smaller mass. That's my hypothesis.
Christine,
Yeah.
we keep track of it with our own measure too, and we're seeing a real similar trend.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense to me though, because I think that's kind of the goal of the berm, right? Is to be able to put that salt there, reduce the salt mass. So that's
I'm just these numbers. I mean, I'm just looking in the record, and we've never had anything this low. So I would probably expect them the bump from now to fall to be higher, but based on the calculations, it's lower. So I racked my brain around about this for a long time last night. And then so another approach I took to make sure this makes sense to me. If you remember back in the day, Scott and I had kind of plotted salinity concentrations, shallow salinity concentrations, and it's what we call an interpreted space. So Gilbert Bay south arm volume on the y-axis in acre feet, and then salinity on the x-axis in grams per liter. And these different colors just show kind of different time periods in our record. So when culverts were closed, for example, is purple, when the new breach opened in green, things like this. So what this allows us to do is say, okay, the salinity is associated with a certain volume for a given mass. And so these lines, we call them isomass lines, they correspond to a theoretical mass of salt in the salt farm. So for example, this 1,000 at the bottom would be 1,000, or well, it would be 1 billion tons essentially in the salt farm. And you can kind of, the evaporation and evaporation and dilution will kind of follow along those lines if nothing else changes. If the mass doesn't change, you get volume increase, you'll go to the left. If you get a volume decrease, you'll go to the right, and kind of just swing back and forth on those isomass lines. So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of walk you through this. But spring 2024, we're at about 111 grams per liter. For reference, we're sitting at 7 million acre feet, so that corresponds to this kind of line on the y-axis, and then we're at about 950 million tons. So I'm between this 900 and 1,000 million ton line. So then we decrease by about 0.8 million acre feet due to evaporation and breach inflow. That's kind of along those parallel to those isomass lines. And we also shift because we're exporting salt. So that takes us to the left, basically, to a different isomass line, which is about 900 million tons. And so that gets us to our fall predicted value of 116. And you can just see kind of that line. So that darker blue circle, if you follow that down, that's sitting at about 115, 116 grams per liter, like I predicted earlier. So this just helped me kind of make sense of the numbers I was getting. In this interpreted space, it is consistent with those calculations that I did. Jeff also asked me to consider spring 2025. It's a really hard thing to do because it's so dependent on how much water we're going to get, how much salt is going to be exported. But historically, this plot is showing the decrease that we've observed from fall to spring, just through the record from 2010 to present. And as you can see, we typically decrease on the order, so dilute anywhere from 10 to 50 grams per liter. Last year, we actually got around 60 grams per liter because of the conditions we had. We have a new condition than anything that was present in this record, but this just gives us some idea of the magnitudes of change that we see from fall to spring. And so if I just basically apply that 115, 116 prediction for fall, and I say, well, I want to add 5 grams per liter, we get 121 grams per liter in this spring. And if I say, oh wait, I did it the wrong way, didn't I? Yes, I did. Because I would be going down. So hang on. So we would do 116 minus 5 would be 111 to 66. So that's just kind of basically the let me just bring that. I apologize, Matt. This would be 111 to did I do it? Yeah, I did it. There we go. Okay, apologies. That just taking kind of this really broad range approach. Does that make sense? Just saying what the change we've seen in the past, let's apply it to the prediction in the fall. It's around 70 to 110 grams per liter. Yep. And
Can I ask you just kind of a question on that? Like, so previously, I think there's been like a different paradigm. Obviously, you mentioned this, there's a different paradigm in like the last 2 years where the dilution is quite a bit different than what we've seen in the last couple of years, because right now since we're pushing so much through the berm as it's flowing in, have you isolated like the last year to 2 years to see what the trend was in dilution based on the volume of water that comes in, to see if it's like consistent or be relative to what we experienced previously when we have bidirectional flows and everything else. It seems to me like some of those past trends just don't necessarily apply.
Totally
So saying it's just going to drop as much as like.
Totally, I agree. So no, I haven't done that, and I think you're right that like last year was a super unique situation because we had it completely blocked off, and so that just kind of bucks all trends, and that's when we got 60 grams per liter. This, Mike, what would you say this condition now that we have it's open, it's South to Norfolk? I guess that would mimic July 2022 when we raised the berm, when we were cutting off north flow. So we could look at, but then that was unique because we had a huge water year. So there's compounding factors here that are difficult to kind of pick apart, you know, but yeah. Wait, sorry, I don't have a better
No,
answer for you.
it just seems like these unique conditions and the
Yeah.
trends have been just blown out of the water in the last couple of years with
Mhm.
how we manipulated it. And then even just the salt mass itself
Right,
makes me think that, you know, if we got another big year next year, the fact that the salt mass has declined so much, a big runoff year would even potentially make that dilution factor go up
exactly.
more than what we've seen in the past. So, I guess I'm just a little bit concerned on the low end side of things, on the trajectory of where we're headed and how we want to manage that things. I think going down to 66, not be where we want.
Right, exactly. And I have to say, it's like kind of amazing how quickly we've been able to
Yeah.
dilute the salt.
I agree.
And we're just flushing a ton of salt to the north, you know, especially getting, 2 years pretty good of a lot of fresh water in and just consistently dumping salt to the north. So I agree, it would be worth
And just another quick question on this, but with all of when we opened the breach, and do you know, and this is before my time here at the division, but do you know if anybody ever tried to calculate how much salt we imported from the North Arm? Like what the salt mass was prior to that breach opening versus what it is now, and then how much we've exported? Because I think this is part of the equation, is that we needed to get rid of, we hit that high salinity level. We're trying to basically recoup what was a consequence of opening up the breach and getting that salt back into our farm. And now, how do we kind of equalize that and keep it at a steady state? But
right. Well, it's really tough to estimate what happened before the new breach was open because there were these big culverts, and as Mike can attest to this, they were really difficult to measure. So the measurements we have for discharge, salt is probably okay to measure, but the measurements we have for discharge are periodic, if I'm not mistaken, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. So it's pretty difficult to make estimates. Maybe Sam would have some ideas, because if it's a fixed cross section and he could look at head differences on each side, maybe there's historic wind data he could use. I'm not sure if that would be feasible.
well, maybe even just, the salt mass balance, I assume that someone's attempted to quantify the salt mass balance prior to the breach opening. And so I'm just curious, like, as far as how the salt mass balance today relates to what we saw, 15 years ago, and we did a pretty good job of being able to hold the salinity at a state that we were happy with, or that was meeting most of the beneficial uses prior to 2017 or 2016. And then it opened, and I think we had a big influx of salt. So if we were able to try to mimic and attempt to get, like, maybe rather than hitting certain salinity percentages, we're aiming more for, like, this is the salt mass balance that we want in the South Arm, because we know that if we're at this, salt mass, then it can handle the different influxes of fresh water. I just don't know if we've ever really looked at it through that lens.
That's interesting. So trying to keep the salt mass in the South Arm at some kind of steady plus or minus 5%. And then it's predictable of how it's going to respond to the fresh water coming in.
Well, and then it's maybe a little more manageable than trying to keep it within a percentage target. If we're doing a salt mass balance, then we can look at, like, okay, if the salt mass balance is this, then we probably want to keep, inflows around this level, and maybe consider opening the breach to try to keep an import North Arm brines to keep salt mass balance here. Or I don't know. I'm kind of spitballing. It just seems like there's going to be some issues.
So like on the graph, yes, what you call it?
So math, yeah.
ISO. So like keeping it between those ISO mass lines, is that what you're saying?
Kind of, yeah. Like, I think if we were to target more on the isomass lines rather than a salinity concentration, because we know that if we have a great salinity concentration of 4192, but the volume is so little, and then we get 2 really good years, it might put us down to 66 grams per liter. And that's going to be a little problematic for industry. And we might even get to the point of, like, having some ecosystem issues if we get too fresh. So perhaps focusing more on your the ISO lines.
ISO mass, yeah, you can call them whatever.
I'm just going to call them the Christine lines. It's easier for me to remember. But if we focus on the Christine lines a little bit more, like, try to keep it within those targets, like, managing the salt mass might be more of a, I don't know, it's just something I was thinking of, like, we're developing this salinity management plan and not knowing what a runoff here is going to do, not knowing what climate is going to do. Maybe this is something we could aim for better to try to, and as we're developing this whole, salinity control structure, trying to decide how we could potentially import salt when we need it or export it to try to keep in that right salt mass might be a more reasonable target. I don't know.
Bill Johnson has his hand up.
Yeah, this is a really nice analysis, and it's really nice to see it follow the format that UGS identified a few years back with these different regimes, right? And I like the term isomass. The point though is that you have to shift the salt mass if you want to be able to control which of those isomass lines you're on, right? And so you actually, that's our strategy, is to change the total mass in the system by a net export. We would only stay on a single isomass line if we had complete mixing between the north and the south arms. And so I wouldn't look at, this as an either or kind of thing in terms of looking at the bottom axis and the salinity range versus the two-dimensional piece with the isomass. This is a tool, and we're just gonna, the only way we can do this is make an estimate of which way to shift the total mass in the system, either by allowing north arm flow back or not allowing it back. But this is the tool. And so, Christine, this is a great portrayal, and all we can do is guess based on what we think evaporation is going to be and inflow is going to be. But we're stuck with that uncertainty.
Well, and Bill, I think that's a great thought. And another thing that just occurred to me too is that, as the breach has been open and we've just been flushing out 2,000 CFS, for the breach, we're sending a lot of salt light, through with that. And that means that by the time it bottoms out or peters out and the flows decline, we're dealing with a smaller salt mass balance, which I think we all acknowledge. And so another tactic, rather than importing north arm brines, is figuring out how much of that salt we want to keep in preparation for next year, knowing that we're going to have, some pretty heavy evaporation. But I think those are all things that they don't necessarily comport with how the law reads about what we're supposed to do with the breach. And so it also just gets into a paradigm where it's we really need to think about that salt mass in relation to concentrations and in relation to the volume of the water that's in the south arm.
Yeah, and I think maybe then what you were kind of referring to is this purple here, where it was maybe 2011 to 2014, the starter purple, or we're kind of on this following a trajectory where it's dilution and concentration are a little more predictable. But I think, as Bill is saying, that's the tool, is adjusting and skipping to one of these other isomass lines to try and adjust the concentration. So it's kind of, both. I would agree with Bill.
Yeah.
So, any other thoughts on that?
If I could just finish that thought, what this says is sometimes you will want to preferentially allow bottom flow in without changing the overall flow. And the problem with the current berm is you have to change the whole flow system just to get some of that bottom flow back. That's why I've always felt that stacked concrete blocks that allow you to leave gaps in the bottom if you need, so that you can make that adjustment. I think that kind of a technology is kind of a grand word for it, but that kind of approach to management of the flow is going to be needed so that you can preferentially bring bottom flow back.
And you're exactly right, Bill. That's exactly what this procurement for the engineering should do. And I didn't put an update on the agenda, but I've been working on it. I've had some weird procurement roadblocks, but I should have something to share with those that were interested in the procurement and the scope of work for that here probably by next week. But yeah, that's exactly what that should do, is we should be able to bring back north arm brines, be more dynamic with that.
Well, it's interesting state we're in now, though, because your data matches ours on this, Christine. These lines, we use elevation versus salinity, but they're so closely tied. And the thing that was so worrisome back a few years ago is that we saw that we were at a lower relationship after the berm was open and the salt moved north and was creeping back. And yours is showing that we've moved back down. Current readings are on that 2017 to 2020 ISO line, and that's the low point from when salt was exported out after the breach was opened. And it matches our salt mass calculations that we've roughly lowered the salt mass in Gilbert Bay, the standing salt mass, to about what it was when the breach had been opened and had moved all that salt north. It has come back down to that low point, according to the data that we have, and that matches really well with this. So as far as reversing all the salt that we got back from having the breach fully open after 2017, it seems like that by your data and ours is more or less been achieved at this point.
So that's exactly what I'm saying as well. Is like, I think now we need to figure out what that equilibrium would be like. The thing that's queuing in my head is like, okay, should we think about opening up the breach completely and going back to the, the kind of speed bump model, or maybe something in between what we have now and that what was put in by Union Pacific, to allow some return flows from the north arm. So we're at that steady state until we can figure out what that engineered solution is and be a little more intentional with that. But I think that's something like this committee, obviously that's what we do, is we should try to come up with some recommendation. Maybe that's something for the next agenda, but if 66 grams per liter is a potential projection, and I know those things are like the Christine ball is only as good as the information we have and how we can.
It's right if you have a plus or minus,
Yes.
minus 100 gram per liter.
Yeah. So I know, I don't think we should just do this off a knee-jerk reaction, but I do think that that's something we should consider is what we do with the berm and the structure this year, especially when runoff subsides and we have a little more room to actually get in there and work with it. And I know you guys, we talked about getting some elevations and some profiles of the berm and everything once we can get in there. And I know those are difficult,
Yep.
but
We did get those actually.
Oh,
So
nice.
Casey's working on finishing up that right now.
that's awesome.
Oh, you mean again? So we're gonna get, okay, we can get
Yeah.
right, we'll get right on that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that after this run up here and have a couple thousand feet to start after that, I'm guessing it's get modified again.
Yep.
Christine, could you show your graph that shows the timeline of salinity? Does that go back to 2018 or so?
This one.
That
2010.
one. Yeah. I think, our water surface elevation now is back to where it was 5 years ago or so. And I remember when this committee started in 2018, 2019, I remember Tom Tripp distinctly being concerned that we were, at the South Arm was starting to become too fresh and we were exporting too much salt to the North Arm. And that was at that water level paradigm that we're at now. And he wasn't super concerned, but that was a flag that he was raising was, are we exporting too much salt to the North Arm? And then of course the water levels dropped and salinities went up, and then I think another point related to that is at the issues forum, Hugh and some others presented on the groundwater monitoring that they're doing. And I guess I'm just trying to connect some of these dots because we over the last few years, we've had this missing source of salt. Where is this salt mass coming from? Why is the salt mass increasing? And from his water levels and that he was observing, I guess the hypothesis is that when the water levels are low, that fresh groundwater is pushing that salt mass in the groundwater into the lake. But now that the lake level is high, it's pushing back. There's enough water mass or hydraulic grade line is high enough to keep that salt mass from coming in. So now we're losing that. I guess we're exporting salt, but we're also perhaps shutting off that other source of salt.
Yeah. That's a good point.
And I don't know how to quantify that, but those are, I think the managing to a load or a mass, DWQ uses that when on water quality regulations all the time. We use a metric of the concentration to know, are we affecting the system? But when you look at loads as well, how can we manage those loads?
Sorry to ask this again, but I wasn't totally clear. Do you know if there has been an attempt to quantify salt mass balances, for like the last 2 or 3 decades, just based off of the, volume and measurements that we have?
Yes, so David Tarbotten and the student Natalie Burke they published a study looking, I believe, from, if I'm not mistaken, from the 60s to maybe the early 2000s or 2010 or something. And then I think we kind of picked it up with our recent study from 2010 to the present. So there are estimates of salt. You're looking for salt mass.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
just curious.
Yep, there are. I think we could probably talk to David Tarbotten about that because he kind of compiled USGS, UGS data over the whole period of record and looked at those fluctuations both in north and south.
Bill?
Just want to add my perspective that the groundwater component of that salt input, we don't have enough clarity yet, in my opinion, to use that as a management tool, because we're finding that there's a much larger groundwater reservoir of fresh water coming in on the east than we anticipated, but that flux hasn't been determined yet. And we know that there's saltier water coming in from the west side groundwater component, but I don't think that's really been sufficiently characterized, those fluxes, to use for management. It's quite plausible that that flux depends on lake level, but we're just not there yet, in my opinion. Maybe Elliot has a different perspective on that, but that's mine at this point.
I agree. I think the only thing we have is observations that we've observed. And when low lake elevation was present a couple of years ago, a lot of salt was draining from, a saltaire area, leaching into the system. We just need more potentiometric groundwater levels around the lake. I'll also add to the lag effect after the breach was open. It took a couple of years for salt to get sequestered in the north. So if it's not precipitating, is it just going to flush back south after a year or two? And do we want to give it more time to sequester?
Great. Well, and great discussion. I think, I guess just to try to summarize the discussion is that, the forecasts that we have do show a potential for salinity dropping lower than what we would like a year from now. And so something we want to consider is looking at how to manage, can we use the salt mass as a means to manage salinity in the South Arm? How can that be? Could we use a flow control structure to achieve that? We want to try to look at some of the longer term salt mass and how that's changed in relation to the flows through the causeway. But I think this is, I think the good news is the lake level is back up to where it was 10 years ago. It's not, and our use of the berm was able to manage the salinity, improve, keep the salinity where we needed it to be when the lake was low. And now, hopefully the paradigm keeps shifting, the water levels keep coming back up. But this is adaptive management.
What we really need is a Christine ball that'll tell us what our inflows are going to be next year. So
I know, but that's then our CS. I'm relying on it. But I guess one last thing, Jeff, if I could, I wanted to just share how this ISOMAS framework might be used to just kind of get an idea of what these really far out salinities would be. And so if we look at our spring right now, 2024, we're at 111. That's kind of represented here. You already saw that. I walked you through how, if we lose water, we lose mass, we end up in the fall of 2024 at a predicted value of 116. Then Ben, it's just a guessing game. How much water is going to come into the lake? So how much do we go up on that line? And then how much do we go over to lose mass? And so I just, it's the question of, it all comes back to how much water is going to come back in, essentially, because that's going to dictate how much the rate of salt export in our current condition. And so I don't know, but I have started to like this framework for just being able to visualize kind of, the processes that are relevant and, where we might end up.
David?
Hey gang, sorry, it's David O'Leary, USGS. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I think too, with some of these predictions, we're obviously not going to know what the flows are year to year, but it probably would be worthwhile to do scenarios of, okay, what's average, what's low, what's high, and at least we can start to bracket some things. Right, because we're never going to predict the flow, but we certainly can set up some scenarios.
And in that regard too, David, I think like that was part of the other point is like in this whole periodicity scheme and knowing that we go through kind of cycles where we get these good runoff years, like it would be maybe, I don't know, it seems like it'd be a little bit odd if we had another great year. Maybe it'll be about an average year, but we're probably about to enter into another drought cycle, right? I think like that's what you're going to say. So I would rather be starting off, at this salinity level and dealing with, managing salinity that way than having done nothing. So I think it's great that we got to where we're at, but I just see how much of a crisis this would be if we had like 2 more really good years. We're going to be getting into like territory where we're now trying to figure out how the hell we're going to export all that salt in the South Arc. So
And how quickly we can do that.
yeah, it's kind of.
John, what is the low, or Phil, what is the low range for when we get worried?
For brine shrimp,
Yeah.
9 or 90.
90.
That's because of predation, right? It's not because
Right,
they
it,
can't handle the.
it creates an environment for citizens to impact, be predators on the brine shrimp. But I mean, 9's the high point of that, so slipping below that, you become concerned.
Yeah, it's a little fuzzy in that way because we know that it's possible for crickets to survive in that salinity. It hasn't been observed here in the lake in that range. Wayne Wurtzbaugh's paper from the 80s, around 50 grams per liter, was a pretty clear indicator of crickets that's replacing our team, more or less, the main water of the lake. And so there's that band between that verification and where we actually have good data, which is closer to 100. And then literature values interpolate in between, and then some troublesome potential shifts in the phytoplankton population observed in the late 90s that were somewhere below 100 down to that 98 range. But the data is not real consistent, solid for that. It's more of a hunch. So it's.
How long do the crickets need to establish? Like if you have spring salinity that's like dips to 80 and then you're getting into the time of evaporation, like do they need a full year at that concentration, or is it like really reactive?
It's a good question because I think they do have to establish and start reproducing, becoming a strong enough population to have that impact. Clare Harbor, which admittedly funnels a bit of Bear River freshwater into it because of its locations, you can see a pretty dramatic change in cricket densities just looking off the docks from one year to the next. And so during that time around 2017, when salinities were about 110, we saw quite a few there in the harbor, but they didn't show up in any great number out on the main body of the lake. So it's
Any invertebrate population responds quicker than anything else. So that's why brine flies bounce back, brine shrimp bounce back once we got good conditions. So crickets are the same, and in Farmington Bay, that's what controls the brine shrimp population there for the most part. It seems like that's what Wayne was primarily looking at is Farmington Bay.
well, that site's out in Gilbert,
Right,
and
but
never.
yeah,
So it's.
yeah, but I mean, we've seen brine shrimp in Farmington Bay, and we used to take some samples out there, but we've never seen a real population in Farmington Bay because it's never gotten, the salinity has never gotten high enough there to. From our salinity matrix, we have one reference where crickets were found in Gilbert Bay in 1997 at 114 parts per thousand. And another reference, creeks that survive up to 150, but populations constrained at 90 to 100. And there were a number of other studies indicating kind of at 90 was kind of the threshold.
Should really be observing that this year, whether we start to see any population changes.
And probably have potentially
Something. Yeah, there's something to prioritize out for.
Well, good. Well, let's thank you, Christine. Let's move along here. Great discussion. I think that this is exactly what we want to be doing, is keeping our eyes open for these, what's coming toward us instead of just being reactive. So
We'll get to the heart of here.
switch that quick for you. All right, so next is just the mineral extraction studies.
Oh.
Did you have slides for that too, or?
No, I don't.
Okay, that's fine.
So this is hot off the presses, and David, please chime in about this. So this, I kind of just got this. I'm gonna try to do my best. So the mineral extraction study is kind of motivated by the idea that previous water and salt balance studies on Great Salt Lake have estimated, the amount of salt and water exchange due to mineral extraction activities based on water rights withdrawals and some assumption of what might be returning back into the lake. And so what Scott is outlining here is an approach to really quantify that, to dig into available data that are publicly available and not publicly available, and say, can we actually quantify the salts, being removed from the lake, how it's cycling in their ponds, and then how it's coming back into the lake potentially. So this initial work plan, which can I say the amount is?
Yeah.
Okay, and the funding's coming through advisory council or?
Right. So when we initially started this concept, there was the advisory council had some funding available with lapse on Monday. So I don't think any work is going to get done before Monday. And so if we were to proceed with this, we would either have to go back to the advisory council and see if this is what they wanted to fund, or alternatively look at funding it like our tech team proposals or some other place where we can see some value.
Okay. So the amount that this scope of work is kind of tailored for is the 27,000 that we had originally talked about. And it's really to just dig into the data, kind of assessing the data, meeting with mineral extraction companies, and specifically trying to get at water pumping volumes, points of diversion, locations and spatial extent of diversions, conveyance and evaporation infrastructure, and then measuring estimated flow rates and flux through the new breach. So putting that data also in the context of what the fluxes that occur at the opening and the causeway. And I think, let's see, we've already had initial conversations with 4 companies. So Morton Salt, US Magnesium, Cargill, and Compass. And there was a willingness to assist us in accessing publicly available data as well as providing non-publicly available data on volume, salinities, and composition of brines from and return to the lake where it's available. And of course, we would have to aggregate that data in some form. We'd have to respect certain privacy concerns. So the data would be aggregated in a form that we could understand the salt balance better, but not share details about what's going on necessarily. Also part of this work would be, as I said, a data inventory that would really help to define the scope for the full scope of work that was identified in the work plan by the Salinity Advisory Committee. And that was several months ago now, but I think let's be attached here. There were 4 tasks there. So this would kind of just be chomping at number 1, which is data compilation. And that would help us to figure out what are we working with and how can we appropriately scope the rest of that work plan. Because it's really just uncertain right now what we're dealing with and how much engagement it's going to take to work with the mineral extraction industry to get all the information. So the deliverable for this is data, as much data as we can compile, as well as a scope of work for further work to address the concerns or the questions outlined in that full scope of work. So there was one other thing Scott wanted me to highlight. The team will be Scott Enoch, Casey Root, and myself. We each kind of bring different skill sets that will help in this endeavor. And he really wants to structure this in a way that we're all engaged at all phases of the work. because these meetings we're going to be having with mineral extraction industry, we can't record them. There's some confidentiality there. He wants all three of us there to kind of make sure we're getting things straight. We all understand the process and we can kind of have each other's backs on like what exactly is going on. So that's kind of his approach to that. David, did I miss anything? I'm not sure if David's available, but and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. Does that give you an idea of what we're up to or proposing anyway?
Yeah, thanks for putting that together, because I think that when it was first brought to the Salinity committee to try to develop the scope of work, I don't think anybody was quite sure how we were going to tackle exactly what the question was. And I think it's understandable that it's taken a little bit of time to try to tackle even just how we're going to do this. So I think it's a really great project and study, and it'll provide a lot of information for how, like this year HB 450 regulates salt discharges back into the lake. Like these are the kind of things that I would really like to have at our disposal.
Yep, exactly.
I'm sure DWQ feels the same way.
Yeah.
So
And
anyway,
yeah.
we can talk later. Maybe I don't know who I should work
I think
with, but
Scott.
okay,
Yep.
we'll reach out to Scott and figure out how to get a contract going.
Okay.
Where we'll pay for that.
That's great. Yeah, and that's kind of, as you said, Scott's kind of oriented towards short and long-term effects of mineral extraction activities to inform these types of rulemaking activities. So it's all oriented with that.
Great, Mark, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to kind of echo what Ben was saying. I think it's a good opportunity to fill some great gaps in understanding, and I think we can learn a lot. So I hope we can get it together and support it and get some funding.
Yeah, Mark, let me know if US Man wants to chip in at all.
And Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as a committee member for going on for quite a long time now, I'm really glad to see this study going forward. I'm a little surprised at how much legislation was put into place regarding that governs mineral extraction before we've had a chance to do a study like this. And so I guess I'm going to express my hope that as this goes forward, that there isn't too much that is happening outside this committee that concerns the mineral extraction piece on, regulation of the lake. And so, because this is the right place for that discussion to occur. And I was surprised how far it went outside this committee with the existing legislation. So I would hope that it comes here where all these players are together before it develops elsewhere. And I know there's politics involved, and I don't even understand those politics, but that's my hope, is that we do a better job doing it here before it develops and solidifies outside.
So since Bill brought up the unenviable term politics, I thought I'd jump in. I think both the prior discussion we had, better understanding salt and the history, what predicting going forward, as Ben brought up, as we're analyzing and looking at different, more adaptive engineered solutions to manage water and salt export from South Arm, North Arm. And in this study, I think we can go back to them, Bill, but legislature tends to do what the legislature wants to do. So I think whatever we come back with, we'll need to come up with a strategy in order to educate them and adapt what went into House Bill 453. What I'll say is 453 was a Herculean effort to make it as productive as we could, given the intent, especially on the part of Jamie, Ben, and Teresa, so the state engineer, working behind the scenes, working with the companies, working with Mark and Joe and others to try to come up with something that is productive, moves us forward from where we were on managing salt and mineral extraction on the lake to where we're going to. So I don't think, at least my conversations with legislative leaders, I think they know we'll be coming back with additional, iterate and adapt, but I think we're just going to have to pick our timing. And as we get better data, be able to come back and say, here's what we've learned, here are changes we need. So I think they're open to it, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that it's kind of like Casablanca, and there's I'm shocked there's politics going on at the legislature, but it is, I think we just need to be deliberate about how and what we bring back to them.
And I'll also just add on to that, I think that the fact that they funded the engineering analysis is a show that they do want to understand and make sure that they're, if there is any future legislation or something that needs to be tweaked, that we can go back and provide them with that information once we get a better analysis, that they're willing to do that. But if there's one thing that I've learned in the last couple of years, it's that I need to over communicate everything and probably give them, a little bit of a heads up about what conditions are and what we're planning to do about that. And so I think I can work with Tim and others to make sure that they know, what the possible conditions are in the future and how we're going to handle that, and then what we're anticipating. So we'll try to do a better job of really making sure they understand the dynamic and the complexities before legislation gets passed, or if they still feel the need to do, passing legislation or run anything, hopefully it's well informed. And we have an opportunity as a committee to help guide that.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
I think as a segue to the next item here, I think the comprehensive management plan is intended to be able to provide some of that guidance.
Yeah. So I think that's my update. I'll make this one pretty quick. Jeff probably can speak to this really well as well, since Jacobs Engineering was selected as our contractor to do both the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake comprehensive management plans. And we chose to do those both at the same time because we have, I guess, a desire or need to do something different and more with our CMPs in the past. I think they've been a little undervalued because they are incredibly useful, and they were great documents. And at the time they were created, they did what they needed to do. But I think in this new evolution of Utah Lake and Great Salt Lake, where there's more public attention, there's more resource constraints, we have more water scarcity, more issues that are coming up, and then also just more pressure on the systems. We have a need to have a better plan in place. And so with these CMPs, there's going to be a really robust public process. We do intend to have, a meeting where we'll involve stakeholders. Likely stakeholders will have a separate engagement where we can engage with the folks that have other jurisdictional authorities and may have insights on how to better manage the resource. And then we'll have general public engagement. And as we work and craft the plan, there will be a lot of collaborative efforts on how we, implement this. And then also on the tail end, a draft that we'll also accept comments and feedback on. So we really hope that everybody in the room, the public, anybody who's interested is prepared and ready to really dive in and help us guide, work through that. But I will say that, again, these plans will be different than they've ever been. Not that the other ones are bad, but there's things that a lot of laws have changed. As Bill mentioned, like 453 does a lot of, there's a lot of differences there. And I think before we treated the plans much like a zoning or planning document. So this is what's allowable here, not allowable here. And we identified, impacts from fluctuating lake levels, but it didn't really give a whole lot of goals and objectives for here's what we should do when the lake is this low. And here are the things we can proactively do. We ought to be looking into the future, using our Christine ball to forecast conditions and try to offset those conditions when possible. And so, and we're going to put the term Christine ball and it'll be defined in CMP. So we're excited for that too. But anyway, we do, it's going to be a lot more dynamic. There's going to be a lot more public. Jacob's scope involves a lot more of a public interface where people can come and see current conditions, what the division's doing to offset, potential adverse conditions and how we're going to manage under those conditions. And so it'll be much more interactive. And then I'd also like to lay the groundwork for being something that's a lot more iterative in the future. So linking to components like the salinity management plan. We've discussed, I don't know how we're going to do it yet, but we would like to have that kind of, appended in the CMP where it references a salinity management plan, but it's not so prescriptive that we can only update it every 10 years when we do the plan. If we need X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that, it would be something where if we learn something about the salt mass balance, or there's some epiphany about how we can do better, we can go modify our salinity management plan and implement that right away. We don't have to go through this massive undertaking through the whole CMP. We can have sections of the CMP that are a little bit more adaptive. So I guess the key term here is we want to be more adaptable. We want to be more responsive And we really want to understand what the constraints are, what the perceived impacts are, what the actual impacts are, and try to tackle that. So anyway, you all should be prepared to get some invites to participate. We have a little bit of process in order to get the word out on the street and host some initial public meetings and things, but we're really diving in. We've had several meetings already to kind of hone in on scope of work and everything that's happening. So yeah, expect some, anything else you want to add, Jeff or Tim?
One of the things I just want to, that I think is great about this approach to the CEP, it's more of a living plan document. Like we used to print them out, and I still have copies of the CEP. I've got copies of the integrated plan, the draft work plan as well. I'd like to also, this is something I've committed for the commissioner's office, is to make sure that it's not just CEP that's iterative, but it's referencing and it's communicating with the integrated basin integrated plan. It'll communicate with the salinity management plan, the burn management plan, and with as the commissioner's office is developing additional plans in the future. I think we have no excuse but to tie these all together, especially the timing with the integrated plan, the modeling that's going forward, the different tools. The one plan that's probably going to be the front forerunner of this, which will, we won't let the lack of knowledge impact it, is the commissioner's office. We have to get out a 30-year detailed plan by the end of the year. But we're pulling information, and we'll continue to, we're committed to iterating those too. But I think we should be figuring out across all the agencies how to interconnect those and have them inform each other in real time as much as possible. So I'm looking at Laura and Jake and as well as Jeff, you and Ben, Marissa. Let's and then as Division of Water Quality, as you guys are updating your standards and plans for the lake from a water quality perspective, the commissioner's office, our expectation is that we find ways to interlock those, and so they're not set in stone, but as one agency finds additional information that can help inform, that informs and impacts other plans, that those are responsive. And so that makes it more complicated. It makes sure that we're all in more meetings. All right. But I think we have to do that given the everything that's going on and everything we've learned over the last few years. So does that be questions about that?
So
great to have.
I think I read somewhere, could the process be speeded up and without undermining everything that needs to be done in order to hold the integrity of what the goal is? Yeah. How do you respond to that? And what's your predicted timeline?
Do you mean the process for improving things or the process
for creating a plan?
From our perspective, the process for creating the plan is a product of how we have done it, where we're coming from and where we're going. I think that like my goal with this plan would be that next time we need to go update the plan, it isn't an 18-month or 24-month process. Because I think what we're going to take out of the plan this time is we won't have the environmental assessment component that's like rewritten every 10 years. I mean, it's great to have that established, but like UGS does a great write-up. I mean, there's all these resources now for Great Salt Lake, and we're doing the Utah Lake study. And so there's going to be all these great resources that we don't need to describe Lake Bonneville every time, re-describe it every time we do a new plan. We can say Lake Bonneville is now really old. We all know what it was all about. So let's not rewrite that paragraph in there. So I think that's one of the places where you can get efficiencies. And then if we're doing a better job about being iterative, then we're not doing an overhaul of the entire plan every 10 years. It's more like what's changed in the 10 years, then what do we need to address? And so I think we can do a better job to lay the groundwork for not taking so long in the future. But unfortunately, this time around, I think we're still in a scenario where it's super complicated. There's still a lot of things that we're learning and developing. And it, like Tim said, it complicates it that we're doing a basin plan, a commissioner plan, a CMP all at the same time. But I think once they're done, it'll kind of cement in some of those factors and it'll be a little more fluid in the future. That's my hope anyway.
Yeah.
And then I think we can say we're not sitting on our laurels and waiting for these plans. We're not waiting for the perfect model for the entire basin. We're moving forward with actions that need to be taken now.
Okay.
We have a tremendous amount of data that we could have modeled from the last 3 years, whether it's on inflows, salinity, that we've got this amazing unexpected case study of you have the berm open, you have the berm closed, right? So we have all this information. We really is you watched the lake fall for 3 years, and then we closed the berm, and then we saw it rise, and we got 2 good years. I think we have this unique opportunity with everything moving forward. Tremendous amount of data that doesn't have, we don't have the model, we can just pull from what happened. And then we've got the, water quality also moving forward on this. And then we've got a lot of additional work on wildlife and on groundwater. And so I think we can point to things that are changing as from the commissioner's office. We can't and change this as, and I've had this conversations. So we have to go forward with making decisions and before we have perfect data, knowing that as we get better data, we will iterate and modify from each of the agencies, but also collectively those decisions and steps we're taking. But, so we're not waiting. Well, that's one of the reasons that we're going forward with this 3-year plan is here are the biggest levers we need to pull. Here's what we've learned and commit in that as these different plans are completed, we will update these actions.
And not to put words in Jacob's mouth or scope creep or do anything weird like that, but if we get great consensus and there's good participation, I don't think it's out of the question that we can do it faster than we normally have. I think it's just a matter of we know what to expect in the plans and how contentious this issue is. So I personally, this go around with how many things we've known or what we know now since the 2013 plan, my sense is that it might even take longer than 18 months just because there's so much to consider right now.
So I guess we want to keep things moving, but I think one of the key things that we're going to be doing is it's going to be an online plan. So shortly there in the next month, I know we're already drafting a website for it. But the intent is that the information, it will be an interactive. It's not going to, I guess we're talking about whether we have to have a PDF of a document. But the intent is really to structure it so that it's more of an online tool where you can kind of self-educate, and try to identify based on current conditions or anticipated conditions. Here are the kinds of management actions that will be taken. And so I think as we go into this, I think if you all can start thinking about, well, what are some of the issues that we need to make sure that the CMP addresses, and what are the potential challenges? Those are the kinds of things that we're going to be asking for here in the initial rounds of public meetings. So I know there's a lot of ideas out there, and what we want to try to do is get those on the table so that we can try to see how to best tackle it, how to best pull these things together. And I think just to piggyback on what was said is, we don't want to duplicate. There's a lot of great information that's out there. So the more that we can reference that information and pull that into this, then that's that's information that this plan doesn't need to update again in the future because we're referencing another plan that in theory would be updated on its own. So it's nice to think about these things, or these are the wish list things that we've been talking about, and so stay tuned. I think there's going to be a lot of discussions here over the coming months, and to get this thing really moving forward. So
Thank you.
Yep. Well, I wanted to, just cognizant of the time, I think Jim had you next on the agenda of the rulemaking that water quality is going through. Could you give us an overview?
It's very short. It'll take 15 minutes. Just a couple actual updates on some of the rulemaking activities that we're undergoing right now. Yesterday, we had planned a board meeting, a water quality board meeting that never quite got a quorum, so we didn't approve these 2 items, but the first being we're finalizing the rule R317-16, which is related to the operator certification process for new operations, lithium extraction, that kind of thing. And we got only a couple questions during the last public comment period, so that is ready to be tied up. Just need to vote by our board to authorize the rules. On the agenda yesterday as well was also to engage in informal rulemaking process for House Bill 453, which I don't know if anyone's read from start to finish of that whole for you maybe. But there's a small piece in there intended for the Division of Water Quality to develop permit limits for dischargers for salinity for dischargers to the lake. And so we've just begun to kick around ways of developing that those permit limits, given that we don't have a criteria established for salinity for the lake. So we're looking at ways that we can express this and implement it. And so we've met with Tim and we've met with Ben. We're supposed to do it in consultation with Forestry Fire and State Lands and in cooperation with the Commissioner's Office. And so because I don't have a lot of time, a future meeting, maybe we will have a little bit more meat and bones in terms of our approaches. But one of the things that, and apropos of Bill's comment, we do see this group as being a center of expertise that we would like to rely upon to assist us in the development of these rules. And so we are seeking, whether it's this group as a whole, as a sounding board, or possibly a subgroup or a working group that we could accept volunteers of this membership to assist us. That's kind of what we're hoping to achieve. We were going to ask our board members to volunteer as well. They've helped us in the past in developing rules and assisting with stakeholder outreach. And so they will also be part of that process. So I don't know, maybe a follow-up with this group would be to send out a formal request. But I'll take any questions or comments or offers of volunteership.
Any questions or volunteers?
I will volunteer.
Well, you have to. I already got you.
Of course. And I'm glad I didn't show up to the board meeting in person.
It was.
I sat there for a while.
Okay.
We were on it. So
Unfortunate.
yeah, it was.
Okay. Not hearing any questions. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another part that needs to be integrated into this whole discussion. So our next item is actually a new topic, and we referenced it at our last meeting in March. Ryan talked a little, well, we as a group talked a little bit about the West Breach or the Lakeside area side, or Gage, Lakeside Gage is what we call it, right? So you want to
Sure.
just
Yeah,
kind
can I
of
share some slides?
for sure.
All right. So yeah, I'm gonna call it the Lakeside Gauge. That's what I usually call this one. But yeah, I've actually ran this gauge for 14 years, kind of off and on. So I'm very familiar with what's going on there. And I've been kind of bugging Christine and Ryan about some of the problems we've had out there for quite a while. And I know that flow is really important, right, for all these loads, for nutrients, salinity, all that stuff. So I just kind of thought it would be important to share with you guys some of the problems we're seeing out there. And if you're relying on this gauge to report accurate discharge, start to kind of see what we need to do to kind of solve some of the problems that we're seeing out there. So I took this gauge back over in the spring, this fall. One of the things is with the really low lake conditions, we didn't have a velocity meter out there. I don't know how familiar you are with our gauging stations, but on the lake, we have to use velocity sensors because we have wind sessions and we need to use index velocity methods to use discharge. This site, because it had sat dry for a while, it actually sat in a pretty highly saline environment, and it actually corroded our whole instrument. So it failed. We got one in, and I put one in April. And you can see the difference in the data that you get with a velocity sensor versus no sensor when we're trying to guess what we think is going on. So it's a very dynamic system. You guys all know that. But because of some of the uncertainties that we have at this site, mainly sedimentation in the Gage pool, we're estimating the discharge here. I think it's a very valid estimated discharge, but there's issues that we're having there, and that's what I kind of want to talk to you guys about. So index velocity methods, mainly the thing that we do is we solve for area and we solve for velocity. Velocity is pretty easy. We drop a velocity sensor into the Gage pool. It's measuring a velocity that we then take calibration discharge measurements. We develop an index velocity relationship. So when that velocity meter measures velocity, we run it through an equation, and we're able to compute a mean channel velocity for the whole channel. So the other part of the equation for discharge is area. So we go out, we survey the cross section. If we have a water level sensor, it tells us what the water level is, and then we can say, okay, we know that we have an area of, X square feet. The big thing with that is we need our stage area relationship to be stable. If that thing is changing, this whole method just is not very good. And that's the problem. So here's our velocity sensor. This is a Sontec XR. It sits in probably the deepest spot that we can get it in at the lakeside gauge. It's very wide there. It's very shallow. So we're in the deepest hole that we can be. Just quick note, you guys can see all the gravel and the cobbles and all that stuff in there. Make note of that, okay? We'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's our cross-sectional area. So this is a ADCP making a discharge measurement. And this is kind of where our standard cross-section is. Computed area from our ADCP versus what our stage area rating is telling us. Okay, so this is obviously at higher flows, probably in like 2017. So we're having this deposition problem in the lakeside Gage pool, and this has been something that I've been observing as early as about 2014. And one of the things that we see is the biggest impacts actually happen in the fall and winter months, mainly because the lake level is low, right? We don't have a lot of discharge pushing from south to north. The lake level's low. And so what happens is we get these big precipitation events, whether generally in the fall or atmospheric rivers, rain on snow events. There was a huge rain on snow event in 2017. Positive. So what happens is you get all this rain. It rains on the salt flats out there by the Newfoundland mountain range, and all that water's got to go someplace. And unfortunately, it goes kind of runs where those little arrows are going. It hits the causeway, which is a constriction, and it gets basically funneled into this discharge canal. This discharge canal, creates constriction, and it hits salt flats just north of Lakeside Gage, and it just explodes. And it sends a lot of sediment and water all over the place. We have measured discharge events at the Lakeside Gauge at about 400 CFS. But if we look at this map here, here's where on the far left, that's where the canal comes in. Kind of does this funny jog, and then it runs out to the east. And if you kind of look, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but it looks like there's an old dredged canal right here where it used to go. But I think as lake level has been high, it's kind of eroded that canal and filled in that canal, so it's no longer available. So what happens is that, we get these discharge events that come out, and then it basically is a giant delta that spreads out. Obviously, water wants to go to the lowest point, right? So it goes to our lakeside Gage pool, and it just deposits a ton of sediment. Joe, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, a couple just detail clarifying points. That's an old intake canal from Bill Coleman's Solar Resources operation back from the 70s and 80s. And then just one minor flow detail on the map with the arrows. Could you go back to that one? When it comes around Hoggett Point, it actually doesn't go straight to the lake as shown. It kind of hugs up against the east side of the Hoggett Bridge. And then goes north to the causeway, and then there's quite a ditch, if you will, that then parallels the causeway. Right where the tip of the northeasternmost arrow is actually old evaporation pond, so it can't go that directly. It really does wrap around.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure. I've driven out there before, and I've seen all the water kind of pooled out by the Newfoundland range, and I know it's coming in some way, and I've never really gone and explored that. So that's great.
It doesn't matter. It's still making it, but it does do kind of a northern jog, and then southeast along the causeway, the embankment that connects to the causeway.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, like this is one of the things that we've kind of observed, and so as it kind of hits this like delta, all this water, it spreads out. So we've measured 400 CFS here, but we also know we have water going to the north arm as well. So I think we're seeing some pretty large discharge events that occur that are depositing a lot of sediment. So just kind of a quick kind of visual. I'm a visual person, so if we think about to that old picture, we can see a lot of cobbles, gravels. You can start to see that we have a lot of mud in here, and this I think was in 2020. And if we kind of just step through, you can kind of see how much sediment is being deposited into this area. This is where that XR sensor was. You can see that if we have this deposition, we're also talking about area, but if we're trying to measure velocity, if all of a sudden that thing's buried, we're unable to compute discharge or measure velocity in that respect. So this is the challenge that we have right now, and this is what we're trying to deal with. So we don't have the stable stage area relationship right now, and if basically the discharge is unreliable. This is why we have it set to estimated. If we look at this regression on the bottom, is actually our index velocity relationships. And so these are the measurements that we've made this year. So you can see how much it's impacting our index velocity relationship because of this cementation. Okay, so we're able to kind of provide an estimate by going out, making frequent measurements, and applying temporary adjustments to our rating. But it's quite poor. So I mean, some of the things that I've kind of thought of that might help with this situation, if we want to get better numbers out of the lakeside gauge, is if that canal could be basically extended out to where discharges is going into the north arm, provide the low point to go north, and it wouldn't discharge into the lakeside gauge, which would really help us out. I know there's been raising of new berm. I mean, that would be something that could be really helpful as well, as if we were to raise this elevation from approximately 4193 to 4194, 4195. We would kind of solve this low point issue. And additionally, if you had a better, kind of berm control, we could also have another way to kind of compute discharge using a stage discharge relationship. So it would only kind of increase the accuracy of our discharge measurements. So those are things that I've kind of just mentioned to Christine and Ryan, and I wanted to you guys. So
do you know approximately how wide that channel is from the opening?
I want to say it's like from the bottom of the bridge deck, it's like 280, I think, but I think lower down, or we really measure, is right around 180 to 200 feet, depending on water level, obviously.
You mind going back to the one that shows the overhead of that? Like you have a map that kind of shows the Garrett there.
This
So
one?
just a thought, but the dredging a channel that long would get pretty expensive, and then also there'd be a ton of permitting.
Sure.
But I just wonder if almost like a jetty type structure that just kind of goes from the west side of the opening around it and was raised to an elevation where you couldn't have that flowing back in, and it would force it back into the north arm.
So like something like right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think anything to persuade flow to go north would be extremely beneficial. And I think the thing is when the lake is high enough, like we're already seeing a lot of that sediment scour, and I've seen it multiple times where it's deposited a bunch of sediment, and then usually within a year or so, it's scoured out or back down to that gravel cobble. But with the lake being so low for so long, it's like every year where it's just like more sediment in.
So Ben, for the RF, whatever, wherever you guys go with solicitation, I have been wondering, and I just don't know enough about the lakeside breach or the just. I'm curious as to, I'd like to see that look at what are the options for raising, closing, what are the consequences, pros and cons of doing that. I mean, to me, do we need water to be flowing there? What are the benefits, ecological, hydrologic benefits, or can we study that as part of this listation?
And as it's drafted, that's certainly addressed in there as an option, or like something to consider or look into. But another thought too is like, if we were able to get the permitting done, the lakeside quarries right there, they have a bunch of reject rock that really isn't, I don't think the railroad can use for anything because it has to be to spec. So I'll bet you we could probably figure out something with the railroad to get rock and probably place it for pretty cheap. But it would be just a permitting aspect with the core. But it's just something to consider. Like I'll bet you there's a pretty low tech solution, but it sounds to me like maybe having a smaller channel to measure flows in might also be advantageous. You don't have.
Oh yeah, it would definitely help. I mean, before we had a lot of the sediment problems, like the relationship was actually pretty decent, So the one problem is if we're looking at like around 50 CFS, I think this is a huge area, right? So 100th change of a foot can make a huge difference. So if you guys have looked at that data, it's extremely noisy. But yeah, a smaller channel would improve on some of those uncertainties. But yeah, and jetty, I didn't even think about a jetty, but essentially just to persuade flow to like go north would be huge.
When we put that out, and maybe something to consider, but we'll share the solicitation with you all. And if you have any thoughts on how we could better describe the challenge there, or look at engineering for something like that too. There's comments.
Figure out what the salinity was when you measured it when we were out there.
I think it was around 50,000 microsiemens per centimeter. So that's about 1/3 of what the south arm is right now. So 1/3 of a 10. So maybe like 40 grams per liter or so.
Still
It's like pretty high for, pretty high for relative to fresh water for sure. It's pretty high. So actually, Max, could you go back to your, like the map you had of the arrows and stuff? So this is interesting. So when we were looking into the missing salt mass, one hypothesis was that there had been a ton of salt deposited in the Newfoundland Basin during the 80s from the West Desert Pumping Project. And Brenda Bowen and her student Mark Radwin at the U he does a lot of remote sensing. And he was telling us about observations of that salt crust actually moving toward the lake. So I've always been curious about how much salt comes from this area. It would be episodic, but the fact that we saw really high salinities and Mike's observing on the sediment deposition is curious.
It's also, sorry, go ahead.
I think Mark also postulated that groundwater is also flowing around the Newfoundland. And, it's flowing with salts that coming to the surface.
Not to get ahead of our skis, but that's also something that I think would be interesting to look at from like a lithium perspective, about how much lithium we lost in the 80s pumping project, and then maybe some potential return back to the lake through the years of migration.
Great. So I guess in terms of any other questions, Mike? And I guess what I'm just to summarize is that we have a very challenging location to measure flow, and we're trying to find a solution so we can measure it more accurately and consistently so that we can incorporate this into our salt management plan. So
should be good. It should be good for rest of the summer. If we get down to 4193, that's kind of usually when we stop seeing flows there, and then we're kind of at the mercy of whatever the weather does. It could get buried again. So, and then it's kind of game over for us at that point.
So the material must be washing through over time, it's still roughly 4193. Yes.
Well, so I think it's a little bit higher right now.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of always look at 4193. That's generally when I've seen it, and I think that I've seen it, referenced in other places. That's the elevation they surveyed it at. So it'll be really interesting to see when it actually goes dry or when it stops flowing this year. My guess is that it's probably a little bit higher, but I'm not really sure. It'll be interesting because we had pretty good flows this year out there. So it could have scoured itself with a nice channel, and it might still flow at 4193. So yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. Jake, did you have some slides you wanted to share? Go take.
We have the map. Did you send the map to him?
A while back.
Okay.
If you have that one, Jeff, I can probably pull it up.
Is that the original map? I can find it. Just a
We
second.
have a printed off one.
So this is somewhat related to all of this, but a while back when we were looking at the GSLAC model, which simulates water and salt balance in Great Salt Lake, and we were trying to calibrate the model and look at the results for how it predicted the salt concentration in the north and south farm, and we were looking at discrepancies between that and observed data. There are challenges in trying to go from the way the model simulates it, which is as a batch, as a lump, well mixed lake bay, and these distributed measurements at various depths. So we're trying to do various things of trying to assess how we could improve the model, and we realized that as I was trying to get a grasp on the salt balance and all of the inputs and sinks and exports and outputs of salt, I realized there was no real material that I could reference. Now that I'm bringing it up, someone might say that it's there. But so then I got to, some folks in the Division of Water Resources got together with USGS and UGS, and we started sketching out a map. And so the main point of the map, so one of the points of this map is that it can be helpful for communicating the nature of the salt balance, as well as educating. So if we all have an agreement that this, these are major components, then it's helpful because we can all look at the map and have a shared idea of what we're looking at, and then we can also make reference to various regions or various processes. And so another point of having a map like this is that it's a lead-in to developing a conceptual model, which is preliminary to developing a numerical model. Like I mentioned, GSLAC is a numerical model of the salt balance, and but it doesn't give a full picture of all the components that could be happening, and it's difficult to track exactly, somewhat in the model, all of these different processes and sources. And so by having something like this, we can identify which aspects we have good information about, which do we have data on, which do we need data, and which processes do we understand well enough, like which do we have good equations for, which do we need more for. And so what can happen is like results of this USGS proposal, is that we could easily identify which of the major mineral extraction, evaporation pond areas, what the assumptions are in that model, what the numbers are in terms of return flows. So we can identify where more helpful, a particular study would be helpful in helping us to refine or complete the numerical model. So there's just other purposes of having a map that's useful for GS.
I think conceptually it helps us just framework
what the dynamics are in the lake, start looking at groundwater inflow, river inflow, what are the lake beds doing, those processes, where's salinity importing, exporting, and how that goes back to the salt mass calculations. So really, it's just a artistic way to look at it, to get our heads thinking about it, until we can start putting in real input data modeling.
So from a, you all have like much better scientific understanding of how these things work, but like in my opinion, like even more taking like an artistic model and something that's also useful for just kind of managing. It seems to me like you could almost attribute, you know, like values to some of these characters and say like this value is attributed to this location, and also like measurements. So like it's a value that is an input, but also is something that measures it. And when we start to see the measurements go up on a given, you know, value that we're measuring, you could attribute it to that location and say like, what can we do in this location to better manage what's happening here? And it just like, I'm a really visual person too, so I think this will be really helpful, and maybe something that in the future, like those values do actually, more than just a picture on the map of what it is, we could hone in and be like, okay, that little green triangle there it means this, and those are the little levers that we can pull here to manage that specific thing. So I think it's pretty cool. It's a neat visualization, but I think it could even evolve in the future.
Yeah, it needs to be an ArcGIS functional map.
Yeah.
At this point, it's just the drawing of the map.
Characters. And I'm assuming you guys kind of just plugged the characters down where it seemed reasonable, but it would be like, so like, I think later on trying to figure out, you know, what they mean and what's attributable to that specific character would be pretty cool too.
Yeah, so that's a good example of where you could take the like overarching knowledge of what's happening here and then derive something that's more useful or some specific application. But you begin with the shared understanding of the whole system.
What's the elevation that's depicted here?
It's 2021, so the elevation is not on there, but those
would have been like, that's in October too, so that would have been like probably 4192 elevation.
So that was one thing that we talked about, was how there are dynamics in the lake that change dependent on lake conditions and other factors. And those aren't really captured because it's just a static map. We sent it out in an email to, I think, most of you, and we received some comments, and they're really good. So we've incorporated some of those. Some of them not quite sure how to handle. Other USGS had a lot of really great comments about, you know, level of detail in here and how much to include. So it's kind of it's more of an artistic balance between, you know, how do you get the picture across, but also make sure it's like accurate and informative. And so I think what I'm not sure exactly what we would do with it. We've talked about potentially having a like very brief publication where, you know, maybe DNR publication or USGS is higher standards, it takes a little longer, but, you know, some kind of publication where this could be available, and it would be, you know, have some more descriptions, things like that. But since this is really the preliminary group of experts in salinity and salinity processes, we thought it would be like potentially we could get approval from the committee as like a sign off that like this is a satisfactory map for representing the salt system. And so before that, you know, we would work with all of you to make sure it's accurate, make sure it has good info, address comments and that kind of thing. Any questions or Andrew? Or you guys can
I think that would be a good thing. Just excited.
Yeah. Could go on the web too. It's just like a interactive map once it gets GPS locations, data, attributes.
And we brought markers, so if anyone wants to mark it. I didn't notice it before, but given Mike's talk now, we have the lake side or the west reach.
The red arrow. Big red arrow, apparently.
Yeah. I think it's a great tool, just because it fosters that conversation.
We'll build upon it over time, but everybody's input is highly recommended. All the uncertainties that you're aware of should be put in there as well. It just is a matter of how many symbols you want to put on a map. Complicated.
I don't know that we would, I don't know if actually like putting it in an arc or a digital map would be the best, because this, like the location of intakes or return flow points, or even like the location of it's all just, it's not exact. It's just saying, there's for this west pond, there's a single intake canal and this diffuse return. So with the map, we'd have to start getting like exactly into the locations.
That'd be a cool version though, is if you did get into the point where, this was attributable to like this little mini basin or this drainage area. And then as you hone it down and you like get more granular, you can start to talk about like what a flow looks like from this area, evaluate trends over time. And then also, as we're talking about draining this terminal lake, it's like, all these flows are so important because they're bringing salts with them. So in the whole scheme of things, all of these inflows do attribute to that. And I think making some connections outside of like direct discharges and salt balances, it's like, this is kind of the start to that conversation in my mind, but it would take a ton of work. I mean, that's like, we're like way up here. It would have to drill down.
And there's ongoing studies, around the lake and where that data is sitting. And so, publishable yet?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, like Jeff pointed out, along the east shore, there's a lot of agricultural return canals, there wastewater treatment plants. There's a number of, there's hundreds and hundreds of points of inflow coming in, like looking at the WMAs and where those come in. So there's just a level of detail that at this level, it gets you thinking, to ask questions, to go in and look at more. But this is really this high level concept, and thinking through like, that's a good comment. Can we represent that with like a single symbol, of like distributed ag return coming in or something? That would be like, that would fit on the map, but like identifying each one.
Yeah. And Jeff brought up dust, that's a big identifier. I don't know how you do that, but
if you put this into an arc map, it could be like a story map where, if you click on this, then it zooms into that area and has more attributes that you can measure and understand. So each click could get you further in and dive in, and maybe that's iterative into the future, but it does seem like this is just a really good starting point to dissect that.
There were some questions, like USGS had some questions about like the number of groundwater arrows that we have, and like the distance from the lake that they are, and relative to the number of symbols in other areas. So there's some refinements to do and addressing comments.
I think what's great about it is it just lays everything out there. And so it's like, as we're all, I guess, researchers picking away at different processes and understanding, like this kind of just serves everybody. It's like, here's what I'm studying and how it fits into the bigger scheme. I don't know, I think it illustrates like the key components really well in an integrated way.
I think you're right. I mean, with all the different studies that are going on, I think this is a great place where we can, maybe that's where the smart figure B is where we can see, okay, USGS is working on a mineral extraction salt balance. You know, these are the elements that that study is looking at. You know, your Christine Ball salt mass forecast incorporates these things. You know, the Division of Water Resources modeling is incorporating these. You know, USGS is monitoring these components. You know, you have specific conductance meters at these inflow points. I mean, being able to identify what we know, I mean, this provides a comprehensive picture. We can start to see, well, what are we already studying? Where do we have gaps? You know, and I think being able to be more deliberate as to, well, which gaps are we going to hold, you know, defer, just being deliberate and making those decisions, I think helps everybody understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what kind of uncertainty we have. Otherwise, it's you know, it's locked away in everybody's brain in terms of what you're studying.
It's like herding cats too, like trying to find the right people. You know, this at least just people thinking and communicating.
So we could send out the latest version of the map to everyone, and then you know, like we got some comments by email, which was helpful. We compiled all those and we addressed some of them, but it might be helpful to have time to discuss those comments, because it's good for everyone to hear them, you know, and hear the discussion. So that would be my recommendation, is if we could have time at one of these meetings or maybe a special meeting, we could just go through all of the comments.
What kind of timeline are you thinking?
How much time do you have?
I'm just thinking, it feels like this committee, we were talking about going to less frequent meetings. But, you know, with this, you know, it's been 2 or 3 months, 3 months since our last meeting, and we have, you know, we have a lot of updates to cover. And so it's more of a, these meetings are coordinating, you know, bigger picture things. This feels like it'd be more of a work section type, you know, separate meeting, just to be able to talk through each of the different areas of the lake and what do we know, what don't we know, who's working on things. And so, you know, scheduling a separate meeting, you know, to do this, you know, in July, August. I think July seems having hard times finding times for meetings in July. You know, that's
Yeah, there's no immediacy.
so maybe in August, September timeframe, we can schedule if that works with what you're doing. You know, we can schedule a 1 or 2 hour work meeting, you know, where people can pop in or out. I think if people have, you know, if everybody can take some time just to look at it and identify questions or things that they think should be included. You already went through one round of that, but if you haven't, if the committee hasn't had a chance to do that yet, I think that certainly would help. And then the meeting can be more focused on, you know, where Jake and Ellie can pull those comments together, and then we can talk about, well, how do we want to incorporate those into this?
Yeah, yep. And I think making sure that all of the most important components are included, and then 2, making sure that it's accurate, you know, in terms of arrows, direction of arrows, types of symbols. And then 3rd, if there's any kind of aesthetic comment, which you reserve the right to read. But there's I think like those main 3, and then I guess maybe you could, if you just sent the comments to us, we could see, you know, it might be easy. Maybe we can just incorporate them all and there's no need for greater discussion, or
Well, let's, I guess as an action item, if you haven't commented on it, that, if you can send those comments to Jake and or Elliot. I think if you want to spend some more time, I guess, discussing these, please, and, note that. And so I think then we can schedule a meeting, sometime in August, September, where for those who are interested and want to participate in the discussion, then we can get together and talk through it. So I guess if you can send them comments by the end of July, maybe I better put it middle of July so that you don't forget. So it's July 15th. Is that a Monday? 15th. Number your calendar in your head, Jim.
Yeah, it is.
15th is a Monday. Or the 12th, July 12th. Sorry, I'm coordinating the vacation time. So the 12th is a Friday. So if you can send comments back by the 12th, then they can incorporate those, and then we can look at scheduling a meeting in August, September, talk through it. Okay. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you. Did you have any other comments on that? All right. So I think we're bumping up here against the top of the hour. In terms of action items, at least what I have on my little list here is, one of the key things is we're thinking about the salt mass, and I think Christine's ISO mass curves are something that's probably worth staring at for a little bit, thinking about what I need to try to understand how the changes in time have occurred and where we are. Just thinking about how we might be able to consider salt mass more deliberately and how we manage the lake and the flows through the causeway specifically. Number two is just the salt map. Please take a look at that and think about where the elements are, where the gaps are, because that then feeds directly into the third action item that I'd ask you to think about is just what key gaps do we have in trying to develop the salinity management plan. I think I had, and I can send this back out, but I've shown this many times before. But in the end, what we are doing already is adaptive management. But what are the key elements that we still need to work on? And I think one of the things I heard today primarily was, what kinds of scenarios should we be thinking about for the future? Because and we don't have time to go through it today, but when I go through the research plan that we initially developed back in 2019, we've done a heck of a lot, and we've addressed just about every single one of these elements, and really advanced our understanding of the system. And I think when I just looking at this whole thing, it's as especially Water Resources is doing, further developing the watershed models, the lake model, it's really going to help us be able to, and when we integrate that with the salt mass information that we're developing, it's going to be able to help us consider future scenarios. And I think that, it is our goal is to be able to be more proactive in how we manipulate the system if we need to reduce our risks, to manage our risks on the lake. And I think the berm management was a great reactive approach. Oh my gosh, salinity is really high. What can we do? And that was the only knob we had to turn, was to adjust the berm, and that worked. But now, as we're looking at, if the lake continues at where it's at, the salt mass continues trajectory that we're at, we might have to dial things back the other way. And so we're working on those things, but how can we, try to develop, especially for a salinity management plan, for a comprehensive management plan for the lake, where the different state agencies and try to have more of a look ahead to think, okay, well, what might we expect in this current paradigm over the next year or two, that we need to start getting things in place, getting funding if needed, or more immediately, what do we need to be thinking about in the next 6 months? And that I think enables everybody, all of the different resource managers, the different users of the lake, to be able to be on the same page and, be able to provide input ahead of time rather than, we have to act now. Anybody have a concern, please raise your hand. That's just a stressful, difficult thing to do. And obviously, I think our systems have worked when they were in that stressed condition. But we obviously rather be in the condition where we can anticipate some of these changes and be able to integrate more of these decisions together. So, anyway, think about that. And then I think for our next meeting that we had tentatively scheduled for August 22nd, is one of the key things we want to do is revisit our charter as a committee. And so I need to sit down with Jim and Ben and just talk about the current charter. Are there any changes that we'd like to make? But we'll get that out to you all, because I think, especially I think it was our January meeting, we talked about just the frequency of meetings and the role of this committee, membership for this committee, a number of things there that we wanted to talk about. So look for that. So, anything else? If not, entertain a motion to adjourn. Or we could just adjourn. Go adjourn. Thank you, everybody.